Welcome all. Welcome to our webinar for this afternoon, or lunch hour webinar for you guys on the West Coast there. Today's topic is drought mitigation. We're going to go through some practical strategies for landscape managers to mitigate water restrictions for ornamental plants. Do a quick little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is worth one ISA certified CEU. If you didn't enter your ISA certification number in the registration box when you registered, please feel free to do that now into the questions box or anytime through the webinar or at the end. We just want to make sure we capture those so we can enter those in and make sure you guys get credit for attending. And I apologize, I'm getting over a little bit of allergies and a cold here, so if I cough, and I'll try to do that away from the speaker here. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to enter those into the questions box. I have Peter Vu, our marketing manager, in the room with me, and if another question does come up and I am not able to, or it's maybe getting a little bit ahead of where we are, I may choose not to answer it at the time, but certainly feel free to ask questions at any point. And then we are recording this, so you can come watch it again and again and again and listen to my amazing presentation. I know it's going to be great. But certainly then if there's someone in your staff maybe that's not able to attend, or maybe there's something you want to go over again, that way you can follow up on those and kind of work through it as well. And certainly I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well. I'm hoping that I'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have as much time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, my intended outcomes for today are to provide you the context of how the current water situation fits into the context of trees. So what does the current drought mean for really trees primarily? We'll talk slightly more indirectly about ornamental shrubs, but that will fit into it very similarly. Briefly understand how water stress impacts trees and woody ornamentals. And then really the meat and potatoes of this is to provide you a few practical strategies for practitioners to use to mitigate the effects of drought stress. So first, let's kind of set the stage of where we are today by kind of understanding where we came from. So if we look at drought stress monitoring in 2012 or 2010, excuse me, for the West Coast, certainly there was abnormally dry components through much of the West, but essentially California was pretty much on as far as ideal water conditions and about average. Much of that, as many of you know, is driven by snowfall in the mountains. And the reduced snowfall over the course of the years has obviously had downstream effects, no pun intended. But if we look then, fast forward to 2013, we're seeing moderate drought and in some areas severe drought, but really it wasn't as severe or extreme. And if we translate then that to plant material, certainly additional irrigation wasn't anything that couldn't overcome potential stress here, especially on our heritage or our high value plant material. Then we fast forward to last year. About this time, we had much more of the extreme drought, covering most of California and the severe drought. But then in the Central Valley and then along the coast, we had a lot of exceptional drought. So this is dramatically underneath normal precipitation levels. And then if we look at currently where we're at today, that exceptional drought has expanded to include much of the mountain regions, and that's obviously shown by the lack of snowfall. So then if we translate that, so we know where we are today, we translate that to where are we looking in the future. And this is important for kind of putting it into a broad context. And certainly I can't predict what will happen in 6 months or a year or even 3 years, but I think broadly speaking, we can look at likely drought will continue to be the status norm for much of the Southwest. Certainly some regions may, during certain periods of time, receive more rainfall. But what is expected due to climate change and just the changing patterns of our climate, that you will see rainfall or precipitation events occur in a much shorter time span, which this unfortunately means that significantly more of the rainfall or the precipitation will not actually be beneficial to our plant material because it's not absorbing into the soil profile. It's going to run off into storm drains and run off eventually into the ocean. So then if we look a little bit back kind of, about how this conditions and the current time frame was set up, tree stress especially builds over successive years. Trees don't respond overnight to most things, especially drought stress, because trees do have the ability to save up energy. They can tolerate some events much more readily than certainly some of our perennials or annuals. That being said, if we look at the picture here on the left, this was taken from a cutting of an elm tree that our own service site here in Minneapolis had to remove. You can see in 1994 through really 2000, we had pretty good moisture, and the moisture, especially on elms, is driven, early springtime is when they put on their new wood, which this is going to have, downstream effects on our plant health care. But eventually we had dramatically less snowfall, but also we just didn't get as much rain in the spring. So naturally the tree wasn't able to grow as much, which meant, if you think about it, it's not able to put on as much, pull as much out of the soil profile, create sugars, and really just plant processes become dramatically slowed down. And the counterpoint to that is because they do take a little longer to even show the symptoms, their recovery is much slower. They don't respond overnight. We need to think kind of long term, especially when we think in the context of our management strategies. Certainly we need to manage those short-term pests, but also we need to adjust customer expectations to fit the time frame. That, if you think about turf, you can have that recovering in a relatively short period of time because its life cycle is much faster. Trees, however, are the opposite. You may have to talk in terms of a couple, 3 years. And then, of course, we have water restrictions, which is a heated and contentious topic, and it's really, unfortunately, it's one that isn't really terribly well understood currently, other than we know kind of broadly what we need, as far as goals have been set. And we'll dig into that shortly. So, based on the exceptional drought conditions and the current status of, using potable water, there is a 25% reduction in urban water use through February 26th. And this comes directly from the Governor of California's office. Now, if you want some exciting reading material, I highly encourage you to go read through the government code and delve into what this means for you. But I kind of pulled out a couple sections here that speak primarily to ornamental trees and the landscape. Much of the restrictions deal with things that are fairly straightforward and relatively obvious to someone trying to reduce water, such as not having an open hose when you're washing a motor vehicle in your driveway, maybe not washing your driveway at all, things like that. But it becomes a little less gray and a little less easy for a practitioner to understand what's, kind of what it means for ornamental trees especially. So if we pull out this a little bit, they explicitly state, it is not the intent of this rule, however, to prohibit reasonable target water application to trees to protect their health. Healthy urban trees provide multiple health and safety benefits, such as providing shade and reducing the urban heat island effect, thereby reducing the impacts of the extreme heat days. That is, important distinction that, trees are an important part of the landscape. However, what you'll see is not included in there is guidelines of, well, if I need to reduce my water usage, what are some strategies I should employ to get to that without, compromising the health of my trees? And we'll kind of dig into that a little bit. And then kind of I pulled this, and it's surprisingly difficult to find clear guidance on this, but this came from an organization called the American Water in California, and it gives proposed target reductions from the base year of 2013. So how much each water district is expected to reduce their water usage, and this is potable water. So for Los Angeles County and Ventura County, those are sort of the higher ones, we have 28% and 32%. Whereas down in Monterey County, it's significantly less. We're looking at 8%. Now, how you get to those is very much so left up to that water district, which then leads to, there's many different organizations at play when it comes to these mandates and how, what they recommend for each. And what's important is that you have the state mandate, the water boards, but you also have municipal governance, and then oftentimes you'll have potentially homeowners associations within this. So multiple layers of governance over this. And it really comes down to the practitioner and the homeowner or property owner to really understand what each means for them. For example, the city of Lincoln, they have put the mandate out there that outdoor irrigation is limited to the hours between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. And then when they're watering, it depends on your house number or building number, things like that. So really look into those, and I would recommend probably speaking with whomever is the closest municipality or governance to that property manager, who's the next up from them, to really give you some further guidance. But within that, if we look at, I pulled up one from, this is from the city of Santa Cruz. They kind of parse out a few things within their city governance, and certainly I think this is where we need a little more further guidance from our government representatives to give us, guidance on how much or in what manners we should reduce our water usage. So they discuss, reducing dramatically the watering of grass, so that we aren't, causing excessive water flow or runoff. And I think that's probably just good watering practices anyhow, because as we know, especially with trees and shrubs, those root systems are deeper down. So a slow, long, deep soak is better than a short, overflow situation. But then again, also they discuss that trees are a central part of the landscape, and that their long-term health is important to take into account. So making sure that we don't just turn off the spigot on them entirely is critical. And I wanted to bring up a point that we need to look at our landscape and really evaluate which plants are valuable to us, because not all plants are equal. And I don't say this specifically as a tree care person, but also as a if you're speaking with your customer, they likely don't place the same value on all their plant material in general. For example, in these two pictures, these property managers on this commercial site likely may not see the trees as the most valuable part on there. It might be the shrubs that frame buildings, or it could be some of the shrubs aren't as important as other ones. And it's really up to the practitioner to kind of have the conversation with the property manager to really get a sense of what do they value and what do they want their landscape to look like in a year, 2 or 3, and really have it within the context of what happens if the drought gets worse. What if it gets better? We need to work through those situations and have an understanding with our customer about where we will be. And I bring up this picture. This was taken just outside of our corporate office here in beautiful Minneapolis. We had a pretty exceptional drought as well. It ended 2 years ago, but it really went for about 6 years. And the properties on the right and left are both at current. They are not occupied, and the property manager, the real estate agent, kept some level of irrigation going, albeit it was dramatically reduced. But they kept some watering. It was often at night, and they did keep the trees irrigated using drip irrigation. The property managers on the left chose to completely shut off the irrigation entirely. So we can see that, and this is only over the course of one summer. This picture was taken in about mid to late August, and it hasn't been photoshopped at all. This was taken on an iPhone that one of our marketing guys was on his bicycle and saw it and just was flabbergasted with it. But I think what's important is you can dramatically see the health effects of not irrigating at all or not having much water going to these trees. The ash trees on the left are significantly smaller, even though the buildings were the same, installed at the same time. And also you can see how much more quickly they're dropping their leaves. And also at the very top of those trees at the very top, that's all ash flower gall. And that's driven primarily, we're seeing so much more stress that the opportunistic pests are just really taking advantage of this tree. So why do plants need water? Well, primarily because they're comprised of primarily water. They're 80 to 90% water. Humans are very similar to that. Water is used for cell rigidity, so in order for them to actually stand upright and to maintain their form, they need water to do that. To move chemicals throughout the plant material. So a lot of our sugars or our base materials are diluted in water, or our hormones as well. They need to be transported throughout the plant. And then diffusion across cell walls. So a lot of that movement of, let's say, a pesticide or a fungicide are carried within the plant using water. So if we don't have as much water, we can expect that the ability of the plant to utilize an insecticide or a fungicide or a miticide is going to be dramatically reduced as well. And then, of course, for cellular transpiration, which is a critical component of photosynthesis, but also for cooling the plant and maintaining just adequate cellular maintenance of the cellular structures. And as I mentioned, 95% of the water uptaken through the soil profile is actually used for transpiration. So most of the water that actually goes into a plant isn't actually used in or maintained in the plant. It just goes through the root system, through the vascular cells, and then moves out the leaf cells. So what happens if we don't have any water? The most generic and broad speaking term is that it causes stress. Canopy symptoms are generally where we start to see things most visibly, but what's important is that in the context of a plant, what's visible in the canopy is only a small fraction of the effect of drought. Really take and consider the root system, how quickly they will dry out and then eventually die. So even when you do have water that is available, the plant may not have the structures in order to actually use that water and bring it into the plant. So we need to think about that as far as our long-term effect on the plant. And then certainly stress symptoms will differ by species, the age of the tree, and then of course the source of the stress. If we're looking at simply no water, but there may be compounding factors of maybe we have competing turf, a limited root space, maybe a new construction, or direct light, reflecting off of glass that's going to heat that canopy up dramatically. So we need to parse out what's causing what and really be a good detective about addressing those as well, all those individual symptoms as well. But one of the primary and the main things that symptoms we see is dieback, and most frequently we see it starting at the top of the canopy. Obviously, it's the furthest point from the soil profile in our root system, so the water has the furthest to go, and obviously that's going to be the first place where we start to see a dramatic decrease in the water. So we'll start to see the canopy thinning out, potentially leaves abscising early, and with that we'll start to see early dormancy or early leaf abscission. You'll see this probably in about September, October, maybe earlier in some parts. But normal seasonal dormancy starts from the top of the plant and works its way downward. So top of the tree towards the root flare, and from the end of the branches, so the branch tips towards the inner canopy. Drought stress, however, is exactly the opposite. The dormancy will begin from the inside of the canopy and work its way outwards. So you'd end up with a plant that has potentially no leaves in the center or fall color on the inside of the canopy, and then it moves outwards. Then we have the impact of secondary pests. Certainly trees that are stressed elicit hormones that can be attractive for other pests such as bark beetles, two-line chestnut borer, and sometimes it's a foliar-feeding pathogen or insect. So they will preferentially often attack stress-weakened trees because maybe the polyphenols or the ability of the plant to tolerate these insects is decreased. So you'll see a proliferation of insects. So we'll need to look at that long-term as well. And then we have stunted growth. So I find this picture quite entertaining. This is downtown Minneapolis, taken way back when. But the point of this picture is quite striking, that these trees were all installed at the same exact time. But those pine trees in that sort of planter area, where there's probably 7 of them together, have a significantly larger root zone to actually grow into. The water penetration is far better than the trees that are in the tree coffins. So the chronically stressed trees likely aren't growing as quickly, and they're going to be prone to more stress and likely have a shorter lifespan. Then we often see chlorosis, and this can be, of course, mistaken for potentially a soil nutrient deficiency, but it could be similarly that the tree just simply the water availability is stressing photosynthetic capabilities of the plant and the hormones required for that. So we may need to address that as well. We may not just necessarily need to provide water. We may have to provide a boost of iron or possibly manganese at a certain point. And then we have standard scorch. So especially in our urban areas where we have the heat island effect or a lot of glass that's reflecting sunlight directly back onto the leaf surfaces, we'll see leaves desiccating as water is failing to reach them. And part of that can also be just the leaf temperature will rise dramatically. Sometimes there can be up to a 10-degree difference between the inner canopy and the outer canopy in the temperature on the physical leaves. There was a study done at Michigan State by Dr. Bert Craig, which was really a fascinating study. And if you have time, I'd highly recommend Googling it. It's a good read. Then certainly there's the always prodigious fruit production, especially if you have a ginkgo or a sycamore. These plants will put out higher levels of fruit when they're chronically stressed. And it's from potentially a long-term evolutionary standpoint that they want to pass on their DNA. So if a tree is pushing out a lot more fruit than you recall in the past, it might be a symptom that that tree is on its last legs potentially, and we may need to do some last-ditch corrective action. So in kind of summary, what does a chronic issue lead to? It really leads to a long-term decline of the tree's ability to tolerate individual stresses. From a practitioner standpoint, we need to look at what strategies can we employ to provide the maximum amount of benefit without stressing the plant further. And certainly within that, the success of some of our plant healthcare materials will begin to decline as the stress increases in the chronic how many years it has been stressed. And with that, we may need to actually adjust our customers' expectations of what kinds of success they can actually get. So in order to yield the best benefit, we really need to have an integrated plant healthcare approach to this. We have to look at all the tools available to us as a practitioner. We can't simply rely on one because the problems that the tree face are more than simply just lack of water. They may have been just lack of water at the beginning, but they will likely have snowballed into multiple things, of insects and diseases to root system decline. So within that, we have in our toolbox, we have air tools, cultural practices, which might be how we water, the time we water, the amount. We may have foliar sprays, soil applications, or possibly we need to do some trunk injections. All of those are going to be important tools and things to consider as we try to maintain plant health stress. So when we're talking about our watering budget, and this certainly is going to be determined by the property, other plant material they have in there, and then also how we irrigate, what method of delivery are we using. And I put this picture of the gentleman here representing a homeowner watering because it's a fairly common question we get. You know, homeowners ask or property managers, well, how much do I need to water and what should I water with? And often we may tell them, you know, put the hose out there and, you know, put it on low as almost a drip and then let it soak for a couple hours or something so that the water isn't running off. It's actually penetrating into that soil profile. But unfortunately, homeowners may not necessarily take that as what they should do. They may just stand over the tree for a couple minutes while they have, you know, a beer or a cigarette and be done. We need to really provide them with strategies that are concrete. Perhaps it's water for 15 minutes a day, every other day on drip. I don't know. But probably if we are able to take even them and the activity they require out of the equation, so maybe we are installing a soaker hose or a gator bag and we're the person actually coming to fill that, or somehow controlling when the irrigation, so especially on a commercial property, if we're able to control the irrigation, that's obviously taking to the next step because we are able to manage that tree's health better than they will. It reduces some of the unknowns. Then we can look at our water buffers. So if we look at, you know, another way to maintain and make our water go further, mulch is a great tool. Mulch will retain moisture in the soil profile. It'll promote microbial activity. It'll improve the soil structure. And also, it'll dramatically decrease the temperature of that soil profile. So if you think about the sun beating down on the soil profile, it's going to dry it out. If we have a layer of mulch on there, it's going to dramatically buffer that temperature and keep moisture in the soil longer. In addition, it simply looks nice. And certainly depth is a component of how much mulch should I put down. 2 to 3 inches is probably adequate, but certainly mulch is far better at promoting root development than grass, especially. If you look at the root system of grass, it is highly competitive, especially in drought situations. It will pull much of the soil moisture out of the ground. So anything we can do to reduce that competition is a positive. Another fantastic tool is using the air spade or some other air tool to reduce soil compaction, but also it's a great way to mix in organic matter, which again helps buffer moisture. It'll keep it in the soil profile longer. And certainly I would recommend, if you're doing this, have a plan to put mulch on top of it, because you are obviously introducing much more air into the soil profile. So in the immediate term, it will actually dry out the roots quite dramatically. So make sure that you have a plan to either install a soaker hose or some sort of mulch on top of it. And this is kind of an ideal situation. So our service company uses the air spade quite extensively, and I think it's one of the most important tools we can have. Especially in new landscapes where possibly plantings might be too deep, or we need to rejuvenate some of these root balls. You can go in, put the soaker hose underneath that mulch so that, one, the water is actually getting through that mulch into the soil profile, and also I think it really looks nice from a customer's perspective, and there's less turf to maintain as well. So why do trees attack stress trees more? Why are stress trees attacked more? Excuse me. Primarily because they have lower sap volumes, so they aren't able to move water and products as efficiently. So they aren't able to respond to attacks as quickly, you know, with their phytohormones. But then also they have to liquidate all of their starch reserves simply to survive. So towards the end of the growing season, they will put new starches into the root system. But if they don't have the energy at the end of the year, the excess to do that, they come out into the spring the following year without any of that extra energy, and they really struggle. And then they simply have less energy to spend on defense compounds. So we need to manage these secondary pests diligently, using our insecticide programs to manage for wood borers, scales, leaf eaters, adelgids, and caterpillars. And oftentimes, when things are going good, when we have plenty of water, Many times we may ignore some of these insect issues simply because they may be superficial or minor, which is certainly in some cases a proper plant health care response. However, in periods of drought or extreme stress, the tree may not be able to survive even these minor insect issues. So we need to buffer that and provide the plant as much space to recover in that. So it's one of those things that potentially in extraordinary situations where we need to treat for these things, a customer may ask why, I've had that problem for years, why am I treating it now? And it's really to provide that tree, and I think this is especially important for our legacy trees or the high value trees that are the marquee ones. And there's a range of ways you can apply this product, whether it's via basal drench, basal bark spray with Transtect, or a soil injection. And this kind of brings us to our kind of final strategy, which is if we look at a tree's energy budget, the vast majority of it is spent on vegetative and shoot growth, with lesser components being spent on reproductive, root growth, defense, and storage. Now, certainly this may vary depending on species and climates slightly, but we do know that by and large, vegetative shoot growth is the most expensive part of the budget. If we are able to reduce that allocation towards vegetation and shoot, that energy is reallocated towards all of those other things. And primarily we see it going into root growth and storage compounds. We can do that using a growth regulator, Camostat primarily for trees. So Camostat is a paclobutrazole formulation similar to the fungicide propiconazole, which many of you are familiar with for treating for fungicide or fungal infections. But it really does four things. It's going to increase abscisic acid, which is our stress hormone, and it's going to increase fibrous roots, increase the chlorophyll in the leaves, and decrease the demand on the resources by the canopy. So it's going to inhibit the formation of gibberellins in the subapical meristem, which that translates to you have less canopy growth and more root growth with healthier tissues on top. I think is probably the easiest way to think of that. So when we have our increased chlorophyll, we have our untreated red oak here on the left compared to our treated tree on the right. Now this was taken 3 years after application in early 2003. And you can kind of start to see a little bit of, on that untreated tree, a little bit of that tip burn. And keep in context, this was during a prodigious drought in Minnesota in the early 2000s. So the treated tree has a thicker leaf, the cuticles are thicker, and also there's more chlorophyll. So you can look at how much deeper green that is. And it's actually requiring less water. Similar story on our untreated versus treated with our sugar maple, which is a highly sensitive species of water. They start to show drought symptoms very early on. You'll start to see leaf curling and kind of drooping. Our treated trees are much thicker green. They retain moisture far better. So all in all, it's a net benefit for the plant, and you see these plant health benefits generally outlasting the physical growth regulation. So if we're looking at physically actually withholding water, plants, and so the graph on the left, if we look at the treated plants, so this is looking at transpiration. The plant will continue to transpire so long as there's water available to it inside the plant. Once it senses that water is not really available, it'll close those stomata, and that's where we see the transpiration rate stop. Therefore, in the treated trees, you still see, albeit lower rates of transpiration, so it's not losing as much water through the plant because obviously it has thicker cuticles, more leaf hairs. But you'll see transpiration occurring for up to 22 days after withholding water. An untreated tree, you'll see it after 14 days, it drops dramatically and there's no transpiration. It's a similar story with relative water content. The two are obviously connected together, but you see the relative water content stays pretty flat for about 14 days after withholding water, And then once that transpiration rate obviously starts to decline, the water content declines as well. But where I think this really comes into a practitioner standpoint is it means the plant is able to tolerate those periods of less watering or no watering, those events, better than an untreated plant. So potentially you could look at reducing the total amount of water you're irrigating, or if necessary, you have to extend out those intervals between cycles from maybe I'm not recommending that you go out this far, but if you had to do maybe every other week, so out to 14 days or every 10 days, the plant is going to tolerate that stress far better. And then if we look at below ground, we see a dramatic increase in the amount of root growth, and primarily we see it in the fibrous root growth, not necessarily the woody growth around the base of the tree. That's actually generally inhibited. We see it in the fibrous root growth. Fibrous roots are where the water is absorbed into the plant and also the nutrients. So these sugar maples were transplanted. 1 year after transplant, we see a dramatic, almost twice as much root growth. Now, think about this in the context of a drought-stressed tree. If it has more surface area in the root soil profile to pull water from, it's going to fare far better. It's going to actually pull more out of the soil profile than an untreated tree. And it's pulling more water into the plant while supplying a smaller canopy. Similar story, our treated on the right and our untreated on the left. We see a dramatic increase, and this was 6 years after treatment. So it's kind of it's an additive benefit over the course of years because the canopy is smaller, the root system is larger, it's able to continue to grow that root system and supply a smaller canopy. So you end up with a tremendous net benefit over the course of many years. And then, as I mentioned, you have thicker leaves with more leaf hairs. So on our untreated tree or untreated cherry bark on the left, you can see how thin that leaf is compared to the one on the right. It's probably about 30% thicker. The cuticle is a lot thicker, so that kind of waxy outer substance is thicker, which means your water is going to be more efficiently maintained in the leaf surface. And then also that leaf hairs, the trichomes underneath, or the leaf hairs underneath, on the underside of the plant aren't going to allow as much water or vapor to move away from the leaf surface, which is a net benefit as well. And so as an applicator or a sales member or a business developer, if you're able to get out on the property, there's a lot of areas where Chemostat and Airspade come into it. You use an integrated approach. And we have a Chemostat opportunity guide, which at the end of the webinar, we will send out to all of you, or at least maybe within a few hours, we'll send out to you as our gift to you guys, the Chemostat opportunity guide. So when you're on a property, you can start seeing some situations where Chemostat might be a prudent option, at least, of where you could start to use it. And it gives you the idea of how to set up the proper expectations with the customer, and then how to determine follow-up options. And kind of in summary, to really bring the point home, so I created these two amazing clip art pictures myself. You can see what a tremendous marketer I am. But if you look at if we apply a growth regulator today, and then come back a year later, the canopy on the treated tree 1 year later should be, and in most cases of most species, this is the case, especially on like some of the coastal live oaks, sycamores, eucalyptus trees, the canopy will be relatively the same size. It'll certainly have some growth, maybe like 15–20% of what it normally was. But if you were to look at the root system below ground, you'll see a dramatic increase in how big that is. So these red lines on the bottom, traditionally we think of the root zone and the canopy as more or less even. So as large as the canopy is, generally speaking, the root system is about that wide as well. Well, if we were to look at a root system of a treated tree a year later or 2 years or 3, you'd actually see that the root system is generally a lot larger. It may not be 2 or 3 times the size of the canopy, but if you look at the density of the roots, that's really where it comes into its own. So you'll see a larger root mass supporting a smaller canopy. And that really ends up providing a net benefit. You know, it's going to have more water to pull in from the soil, more nutrients, and it's going to improve the tolerance of additional stress. So really, in the long run, we don't know how long this drought will last. We need to determine and write out a 1-year plan, a 2-year, and up to possibly a 5-year plan, really for that specific plant. So if, you know, just a couple of broad situations, maybe if things get worse, maybe this is a plant that we remove. Maybe it's a plant that we focus on more diligently, and really have that conversation with the customer, and really don't rely on one tool to solve all your problems. You really need an integrated approach using a variety of tools and strategies. And certainly we don't know when water restrictions will end, because they certainly could get worse. But within that, we can protect trees for the long term. And with that, are there any final questions? Well, I thank you all for attending. Make sure you enter in your ISA numbers if you haven't, and certainly please feel free to provide us feedback whether this webinar was helpful. We always like to make sure that our topics are relevant to you, that they aren't off topic or not relevant to what you guys are seeing in the field. And then certainly if there's another topic you'd like to hear from us in the future, we're more than happy to do that. Yeah, other than that, thank you so much.